What drives an 18-year-old to jump off a boat straight into hell, knowing he might not make it out alive? On June 6, 1944, over 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel and invaded a nightmare. Today, you will relive the largest military landing in history, a story of courage, despair, sacrifice, and freedom. But before we dive into this epic moment of World War II, you know the drill. Subscribe to the channel, drop a like, and tell us in the comments what other untold battles you'd like to see brought to life. All right, soldier, lock and load. Let's hit the beach. What does it take to prepare the largest amphibious invasion in history? On the green shores of England, the wind blew gently among the tents and lined up vehicles. It seemed peaceful. But behind that deceptive silence, the world held its breath. Because there, among trucks covered with tarps and soldiers playing cards under the mist, the gears of an operation that would change the course of humanity were turning. D-Day. Europe was engulfed in darkness. France, occupied by the Nazis since 1940, lived under surveillance, fear, and repression. Meanwhile, the Allies were secretly planning a devastating blow against Adolf Hitler to break through the Atlantic Wall, a line of defense stretching from Norway to Spain. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, led the coordination of an unprecedented feat. Over 150,000 soldiers, 5,000 ships, thousands of planes. It was an operation so massive that its very success seemed unlikely. But there was more than just logistics behind the mission. There was psychology. Allied commanders created an elaborate web of disinformation, making the Germans believe the invasion would take place in Calais, not Normandy. Inflatable tank maneuvers, fake radio transmissions, and double agents crafted the perfect illusion. Hitler took the bait. On the night of June 5, 1944, Eisenhower gathered his generals. Outside, thunder roared like a premonition. The storm in the English Channel threatened the plan. Postpone? Cancel? The tension was suffocating. But at 4:15 in the morning, the decision was made. The general looked at his men and said just one phrase: "Let's go." Meanwhile, on crowded ships, young Americans took deep breaths. Many had never seen combat. Others had lied about their age to be there. In their pockets, letters for their mothers, pictures of girlfriends, crucifixes clutched with trembling faith. The next day would be June 6, 1944. They didn't know it yet. But as they crossed the Channel, they would be stepping into eternity. At 6:30 in the morning, the gates opened, and hell came with it. The sound of the ship's engine was muffled by the roar of the sea. Inside the landing crafts, dozens of soldiers gripped their helmets, swallowed their fear, and murmured silent prayers. The chill of the British dawn still burned their skin, but in their chests something even colder grew, the awareness that when those ramps dropped, many would not make it out alive. The destination was Omaha Beach, one of the 5 beaches chosen for the invasion. Unlike the others, it was surrounded by cliffs, fortified bunkers, machine gun nests, and minefields. It was a death labyrinth engineered by Hitler's architects to crush any invasion attempt. At 06:26, the first boats ran aground on the damp sand, and then chaos began. The German MG-42 machine guns roared with superhuman fury. Tracer rounds cut through the air like incandescent blades. Men fell before even touching the ground. The seawater, once crystal clear, was stained red. Bodies floated alongside backpacks, rifles, and empty helmets. Communication was impossible. Shouted orders were lost amid the thunder of cannons and the desperate screams of the wounded. Many soldiers never made it off the boat. Others crawled across the sand, searching for any elevation, any bomb crater that could shield them from the bullets. And yet, they advanced. There was something almost irrational about that blind march against the impossible, a sense of duty that surpassed fear. Some soldiers used corpses as shields, others detonated mines with their own bodies to clear a path for the next platoon. The Germans, high up in their bunkers, watched that scene in horror. Because despite the colossal losses, the Americans did not stop. It was as if an invisible force was pushing those men forward, a force stronger than fear, more stubborn than death. Hours later, when a group finally broke through the defensive line and climbed the cliffs, the silence that followed was not of relief. It was of astonishment. They had done it, but at what cost? Around 2,400 Americans died on Omaha alone. Many were never identified. Others were buried right there, on top of the cliffs, beneath white crosses that still face the sea today. On that day, freedom stepped onto Europe through the blood-soaked sands of Normandy. In war, survival is never something you do alone. When the gunfire paused for a moment, what remained was the sound of groans. Men crying out for help, calling for their mothers, desperately trying to hold their own intestines with their hands. And amidst that hellish scene, the deepest bonds that war could create began to emerge. The one who was just a stranger from the other side of the camp yesterday was now the only one holding your hand as the world crumbled around you. The trench mate, the partner in silence, the only one who truly knew what it meant to be alive in a place where everything tried to kill you. In small groups, American soldiers began to regroup. Many had lost their units, their commanders, their maps. But they kept moving, because now they weren't fighting just for a mission. They were fighting for the one next to them, for the one who shared the last cigarette, who lent a canteen, who laughed at the girlfriend's letter even without knowing her. These bonds weren't of blood, they were of survival. John, a young man from Texas, dragged his wounded friend for nearly 2 kilometers under crossfire. Every step was a challenge, every movement could be the last. But he didn't stop. "He covered me when I fell. Now it's my turn to cover him," he said, his face smeared with mud and tears. Another soldier, Patrick, from Boston, had his leg shattered by a mine. His platoon wanted to leave him behind. It was protocol. But no one had the courage. They placed him on a door, ripped from a destroyed cabin, and carried him up the hill under German fire, never letting go for a single moment. The war revealed the worst of humanity, but also, for brief moments, the best of it. These moments of anonymous heroism were not in the newspapers. They were not recorded in the day's orders, but they were etched in the eyes of those who returned, and in the memories of those who stayed behind. Amidst the chaos, small islands of humanity emerged, and in them, soldiers discovered that even in hell, love for one's neighbor could still flourish. Could a single beach really bring down the Third Reich? In the German High Command, the reaction was immediate and chaotic. When news of the Normandy landing reached the Nazi headquarters, at first, many believed it was just a distraction. Hitler, convinced by the Allied disinformation maneuvers, thought the real attack would happen at Calais. For crucial hours, he refused to release armored divisions that could have turned the tide. That mistake would cost him dearly. While the Germans hesitated, the Allies acted. British, Canadian, and American troops consolidated their positions. French villages were liberated street by street, house by house, under the watchful but hopeful eyes of the civilian population. Nazi flags were torn from balconies and replaced with white handkerchiefs and shouts of "Liberté." Operation Overlord was not just military, it was symbolic. For the first time in 4 years, the ground of Western Europe felt the weight of American boots, not as an occupation, but as liberation. With the Allied advance, Hitler was forced to divert precious resources from the Eastern Front, where he was desperately fighting against the Soviets. Tanks, supplies, and men were pulled from the war against Stalin to try to contain what already seemed inevitable, the collapse of the so-called Fortress Europe. And with that movement, the Third Reich began to bleed from both sides. German supply lines were collapsing. The Luftwaffe, Hitler's air force, was practically powerless against Allied air superiority. and the French resistance, until then hidden, began sabotaging railways, intercepting messages, and eliminating Nazi officers in the shadows. Meanwhile, on the beaches and fields of Normandy, the advance was slow but steady. The losses were heavy, but the determination was unshakable. Every kilometer gained was paid for with blood, sweat, and silent promises to never turn back. The fortress Europe, once considered impenetrable, had been breached. The myth of Nazi absolute power began to crumble, not with cinematic explosions, but with every soldier who planted his flag in the French mud and moved one step forward. The doors of Europe had been opened, and with them the fate of the world was about to change. What remains after the echoes of gunfire fade? When the smoke of war began to dissipate and the fields of Normandy bloomed once again, it wasn't just the soil that carried scars, it was the memories, the voices that echoed in the minds of survivors. The names engraved on perfectly aligned white crosses facing the sea that once brought as much blood as it did hope. D-Day was not just a military victory, it was a watershed moment in the collective conscience of humanity. There, the true cost of freedom became clear, not in speeches, not in books, but in lives, in silent sacrifices made by men who never sought glory. Today, the cemeteries of Normandy hold more than just bodies. They hold stories. A helmet with a flower, a faded photo left on a gravestone, a white-haired veteran standing silently before the tomb of the friend who never came back. These are the small rituals that keep the memory of what happened on June 6, 1944, alive. The generation that fought in that war is leaving us. But their legacy remains, not as banalized heroism, but as a constant reminder that peace is fragile and must be defended with courage and humanity. D-Day taught us that the unity of nations can break any empire of oppression, that the bravery of young men, many still boys, can tear down walls built with hate, and that good, even if silent, endures. At the edge of the cliffs of Omaha, where the wind blows over the crosses, there is a phrase that echoes without being spoken. They came not for conquest, but for liberation. And the world was never the same. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video and you're passionate about this kind of content, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming videos and discover more fascinating stories. See you in the next video.